It's the start of a new year. Welcome to 2020, and we're going to take a look back at previous decades because what better way to start out a new year than by looking backwards? Hey there, this is Perch, and welcome to Comics on Perch. Wait, no, that doesn't sound right. Welcome to 2020, a year where audio quality hopefully will get better, probably won't. My rambling will probably get worse. You're aging because that doesn't help anything. But what we're going to do is take a look at previous decades and then use it to forecast a little bit what we think will happen in 2020. And we're going to look by decades. 2020 is not just a new year. We're starting off a brand new decade, a brand new 10 years of comics. And if you look back, you see some very distinct patterns play out with comics. So I'm going to take you back all the way to 1970 and look a little bit about what comics were like, what was going on at the time, and what we could learn. So if you go to 1970, what was going on at the time? Well, first of all, DC was doing a lot better. It was probably the dominant company at the time, at least by the minds of fans. Batman and Superman and many of those books were fresh and very clear in the minds of the mass public. Now, Marvel was doing some big things too. You had the Avengers, you had Spider-Man. We had just come off of introducing the Zodiac, and Spider-Man was doing things with the Chameleon, and there was just a lot going on in terms of Marvel fleshing out their line. But the hearts and minds of at least kids and the people who would become the big comic readers over the next 50 years was with DC. And the person who is probably at the center of things in a lot of ways was Neil Adams. Neil Adams had been winning awards. He was a big name at DC, certainly doing things with Green Lantern, Green Arrow, with Batman. You had Denny O'Neil, you had Roy Thomas. You had a lot of really big books coming out, and you also had the critics and the fans were pretty aligned. Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Batman, these were comics that people loved. They were comics that critics loved. And it was a good time, at least a very innocent time, if you will, of comics. You were seeing Marvel put out a lot of titles trying to kind of capture the right mix of things, but the world belonged in a lot of ways to DC. But that decade, things would change quite a lot. Unfortunately, later in the 70s, around 1978, you had what was called the DC implosion, which was a kind of a jokey reference to the DC explosion. DC, a couple of years earlier, had been touting a number of new titles and new pages, really trying to fend off what was becoming a pretty strong resurgence by Marvel. And so DC was going to match them book by book and even go bigger. Unfortunately, all of that overextended them, and in 1978, DC laid off a ton of people, canceled roughly half of their comics, and it was seen as the darkest days of DC in a lot of respects. Big, beloved creators and people on staff were let go. Larry Hama, Al Ilgram. There were some major titles canceled, including nearly Batman. So if you think about where kind of the world was at just 8 years earlier, you had a really kind of a very nice view of DC and some of their characters. And then 8 years later, you had an implosion of a lot of their comics going away. And all this led to the 80s. And what happened in the 80s? Well, Marvel happened in the 80s in a lot of ways. And really, what started to occur was you had the X-Men really starting to click. You had John Byrne roll from the X-Men over to Fantastic Four. You started to see Marvel really branch out quite a lot, whereas you saw DC in almost a shell-shocked kind of state. It was a strange time. And you are also seeing a lot of kind of Marvel's, if you will, B characters, the Moon Knight and She-Hulk, and some of those titles come along as we entered into the 80s. And you saw a really big boom in characters. Marvel just started printing new characters like crazy, most of them, or many of them, coming out of X-Men. You had the emergence of Taskmaster, who will be part of the new Black Widow movie. You had, you had the Hellfire Club. You had the Imperial Guard. You had Kitty Pryde. You had She-Hulk herself. You had all kinds of characters start to play out, and what you would see is DC chasing Marvel for much of the 80s. But it's also worth noting, you saw some really incredible indies starting to come out. You saw some pretty interesting publishers and people starting to do their own thing, and a lot of really beloved titles. It's also worth noting that you saw a pretty weird Avengers 200, which was a comic that basically managed this title managed to take Captain Marvel and throw in kind of abduction and mind control and incest and rape, all within one neat little package that Marvel has desperately tried to move away from the entire time. But the 80s gave us Secret Wars. It gave us Crisis on Infinite Earths. Basically, the 80s were, I'd say, the decade where the publishers figured out that events could sell lots and lots of books if they did it right. And we saw an increase in crossovers, an increase in event-type storylines that would really take us into the 90s. And in the 90s, we got to see a lot of new artists and kind of a push of style over substance, if you will. Some people will really disagree with that kind of classification on the 90s, and I have a video coming up more on the 90s in a bit. But 90s were really about they were about, first of all, the indie scene blowing up. This was the birth of Image Comics later in 1992. In 1992, you had Image Comics get formed. But if you think about the compression of 1990 to 1992, 1990 not only gave us a bunch of storylines and a bunch of X-Men related things. I mean, X-Men was where everything was at. It was all about X-Men at that point, and they were just definitely just kind of digging that hole. That's probably not the way to put it. They were milking that franchise, let's put it that way, as hard and fast as they could. And so you saw everything largely revolved around kind of extreme storylines, very artistic push storylines. You saw Rob Liefeld really come into his own with with New Mutants and with ultimately X-Force. But if you think about the 90s for a moment, and just if you will, you have 1990, where you had Jim Lee, you had Mark Silvestri, you had Rob Liefeld, you had Eric Larson, you had Todd McFarlane, you had a bunch of people really dominating the scene. And if you go to 1 year later, 1991, you had the launch of X-Force. You had the launch of the X-Men, and there are all the variants there. You had Uncanny X-Men. You had a bunch of books. It was all about X-Men, and a little bit about Batman in there, but mostly X-Men. And the Punisher was a really big name back then, and Spider-Man, and that was it. If you went down and you looked at kind of 90s, early 90s, it was X-Men. It was X titles. It was a little bit of Batman. It was a bit of Spider-Man, and that was it. If it had an X on it, it was selling. But 1 year later, in '92, you had all of the big creators who pushed these X titles all vanish off to Image and start to do their own thing with Wildcats and Youngblood and Savage Dragon. Certainly, you had Todd McFarlane, who was certainly the Spider-Man guy that was keeping Spider-Man in the mix. He's moving over to Spawn. And you had kind of this in the course of 2 years, this massive shift. You also had behind the scenes this kind of boom for distributors. You had easy terms, big competitive market from a lot of the comic distributors. You had the direct market really go full steam, and so you had a bunch of comic shops open up, a ton, in the early 90s. Unfortunately, the second half of the 90s would go the opposite direction, where you had comics closing, you had a lot of people flame out, you had the giant distributor collapse into ultimately Diamond, and you had just the industry as a whole take an absolute beating. And I think it's probably worth noting that in there, you also had the little problem of, a lot of these books were late. A lot of the big kind of fanfare that went out around Image stuttered to a halt as the 90s went on. and late books and shipping issues and kind of stores and fans and everybody not really understanding what to do with this giant pile of comics left us with a pretty hollowed out state by the time that the 90s came to an end. And the end of the 90s were also predicated on a bunch of down year. This was the worst slump the industry as a whole had seen since 20, 30 years at least, and it's hard to even track beyond that. This was the worst time for both shops and comics as a whole of a massive, massive slump. So what happened as we went into 2000? Well, all the publishers kind of collapsed their slate a bit. They went to publishing fewer books, fewer copies. They did, we were still kind of reeling from a down year that would continue for a little bit. And then, DC had started to creep back in and win in some cases. But late in 2000, a little thing called Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men started to really take hold and do really, really well. And that would set the stage for the first 4 or 5 years of 2000, where you had certainly a highly dominated X-Men world. X-Men was still top of line. Punisher was still doing well. Spider-Man was still in there. DC was doing well in that underlying tier, where they were being able to put out a lot of kind of their middle ground titles and start to kind of climb back up a little bit. But definitely all about the X-Men. The Image books had started to somewhat fall away a little bit. Spawn was still there. You had some of the Top Cow books still in the mix. You had Fathom and things like that. But it was still it was Marvel's world by every stretch of imagination. You had one of my favorite books, by the way, come out early 2000 called Midnight Nation. If you haven't seen that by Gary Frank, that was a pretty incredible book, all told. Sorry, I took a little pause there. J. Michael Strakowski is the writer. Gary Frank is the artist, of course. Midnight Nation. Need to give both people credit. That's a great book. If you've never heard of it, go check that out. But 2000s were a rebuilding time. You had DC kind of over creeping up a little bit on Marvel in terms of sales, but you had Marvel with the Ultimate Universe kind of find that second life, and certainly the X books were carrying the bulk of things, but the X books were also starting to feel exhausted, if you will. They were starting to feel like things had just gone to that well a few too many times, and so the 2000s were a lot around recalibration. But what a huge difference if you go 10 years later now to 2010. So what was going on in 2010? Well, Marvel was handily beating DC at this point. You had the Avengers with Brian Michael Bendis had really kind of taken hold. You had Avengers #1 kind of eke out there right as 2010 rolled around, with 175,000 copies being sold. The X-Men was doing just fine as well. You had but you went immediately into this vampire storyline in San Francisco, which would turn out to be strange. But basically, the 2010s were going to see the X-Men kind of fade away, having gone to that well a few too many times, and you had the Avengers begin their kind of epic rise with the Heroic Age and Siege, and the Dark Reign storyline had really done quite well for them overall. But DC were starting to put some really foundational pieces in. You had Blackest Night come out. You were seeing the Jeff Johns kind of epic being written, where his titles were doing incredibly well, and they were going to bring DC back into a mix where a few years later they would move on and try out the New 52. But the 2010s would see kind of Marvel go a lot more into the realm of, if you will, kind of just going to their core franchises over and over. Unfortunately, Marvel didn't learn lessons from what happened with the X books, and instead went to a world of no restraint, where they would take a title, it would do well, and then they would immediately push off 20 versions of this, which would give them a short-term boost, but very little longevity. And so they would have to keep chasing that new big book, if you will. And if you look at 2010 to 2020 now in the world of Marvel and DC, you see two very interesting tales. You see the New 52, and certainly that caused DC to beat Marvel for quite some time, at least a couple of years. But whereas in the 80s, the 90s, and even the 2000s, you had things play out much slower. You had runs and books and events that would go on and really kind of carry things for a period of time, and then slowly one thing would give way to another. And from 2010 to 2020, you saw almost attention deficit disorder, where you had books that would go out, and a year later it would be like completely forgotten, and they'd be moving on to the new thing. It's a lot of people have commented about kind of the new Hawkeye and America Chavez and this new wave of heroes that Marvel has had. Well, sit back for a moment, just contemplate that 5 years ago these characters really didn't exist, not in any meaningful way. 10 years ago, none of them existed. So the lifespan of these new initiatives is really tight and really short, and it's really striking when you think about how rapidly things are going. In fact, it's interesting, if you go back to Avengers Academy and books like that 10 years ago, you see a whole cast of characters that are just vanished now. Where are they? Who knows? Who cares? We're off to the new ones. And and you see some of the same things with DC. In fact, you've seen more lately with DC, where you've got Naomi and you've got Wonder Comics, and you have some of those things coming up, and you do see some usage of old traditional characters. Certainly you do, but you also see more of a desire to create new IP and throw that out there, which is fascinating given that Marvel and DC own their IP. Part of the lessons of the 90s was that creators would want to come in and own their creations. And to see it now kind of move the other way, where characters are freely given to these big two companies and created almost on a monthly basis, and out they go, and they get a little bit of run, and if they sell even reasonably well, you get things like the marketing for Naomi was the best-selling new character ever, the hottest sensation there is. That's marketing. But it's striking to think about, we're willing to throw those labels on something so rapidly. It almost seems like it's setting things up for failure. But anyway, so that was a quick little run through the last several decades. What does all this mean for 2020? I think what you're going to see is you're going to see something similar to what happened to DC in the late 70s, but without all the layoffs. I think you are going to see a withdrawal back to a core set of books. Not right away. I think there's going to be one last hurrah in 2020 for a year or two, where you'll see the 5G initiative, and you'll see all these new books that they'll throw out. I see a ton of parallels between the DC explosion and then a year later the DC implosion. And I think the same exact thing is going to go on at DC. A lot of new books, a lot of new characters, a lot of new stuff thrown at the wall, and then suddenly a dramatic pullback of their books, their line, to try and straighten things out, become more homogenous with their parent company and what they're trying to do. So I think that's what's going to go on. I think over in Marvel territory, you're definitely seeing more of a push to X-Men. This is going to be the decade where you see X-Men movies come out of the MCU. So you're going to see a lot of attention and care and chokehold, if you will, depending on your point of view, on those books. And you're going to see kind of more protection over Marvel's properties as a whole, particularly as they try to align with global distribution, going to China, getting their movies out, Disney Plus, all of those things. It's all going to result in more control over those books. That's why Feige was put in charge of Marvel, their publishing division. You will, I think, see some pullback. I think you're going to see more reluctance of Marvel to publish new titles, new number one. Well, sorry, you'll see plenty of new number ones, but you're going to see fewer overall books, I think, as Marvel just starts to make sure that they're putting their best foot forward. What Marvel and Disney do not want at this point is an embarrassment. They don't want another, artist for X-Men number one putting in anti-Jewish messages into the backgrounds of the comic. They don't want that to occur again. It's bad, and I think you're going to see all big corporations become a lot more sensitive to scandal. They're going to be a lot more aware of what some of this stuff is. And this is going to be true of corporations everywhere. The Wild West of social media is coming to an end, and you're going to see a lot more restraints put on. People will cry foul. A lot of the creators will be really upset about it, but you're not going to see the big corporations allow creators to kind of go as wild as they have been. So you're going to see a lot of creator accounts become protected, and you're just going to see this closing of the doors. On the indie scene, I think Image will continue to do well. I think we're going to see a couple of the small indies boost up a little bit. Maybe I think Vault and Boom and some folks like that, I think, are going to get a little bit of a higher profile as they find their footing. I do think that some of the crowdfunding effort, if it can stabilize a little bit, I think you're going to find some partners there in the traditional publishers who are going to kind of want to come in and kind of get involved and help steer that a little bit. And it'll be interesting to see where it all goes. But it's a brand new year. I'm excited to see what happens. I'm excited to keep doing these videos. I hope you like them. I hope they've been informative. And I hope, whether you agree or disagree, it's giving you some things to think about. I've said this before and I mean it. If people come in and they disagree, I don't mind. Not at all. In fact, it's fun when people disagree. I enjoy that dynamic. I enjoy, especially if somebody comes in, they disagrees and they're not flaming jerks about it and they just want to say, your conclusion is wrong and here's why. That's great. I learned so much from those lessons. So I hope more of that occurs, and I hope that, if you hear something you don't like, come back tomorrow. Maybe you will hear something you like. Or find a different channel that is something you like. Either whatever makes you happy. Let's make 2020 the year where more of us are happy. That would be a nice thing. Anyway, Happy New Year to everybody. Hope you enjoy the channel. As always, like, subscribe. I should say at the beginning. All these smart channels say that at the beginning. They get that out there, and they're like, because people have tuned out by now. Anyway, leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know you're out there. Follow me on Twitter at Perch. Throughout 2019, thank you for listening.